My name is Alan Peaceman, and I'm from the Chicago area. And last month or 2 months ago at an APAC event, we had a speaker who talked about the Iran being just about out of hard currency, that they're down to their last $10 billion of hard currency. How do they buy weapons if they're out of hard currency? And can they continue their strategy, when it gets down to that point? Can they last any longer?
Let's take 2 questions at a time.
David Samuel from Tampa, Florida. Thank you for your insight into all this. I'd like to throw the simulation into the people having what they called the Green Revolution in 2009 and some uprisings that are going on now that don't seem to have a name, as to what the pressures that are presently in place and how that might change the paradigm as well.
Okay, so those are somewhat related to each other.
Right.
Who would like to take the first shot? One about Iran's shortfall of hard currency, the other about some type of pressure for some type of people's revolution and how that may affect the scenarios. Either of you or both of you? Chuck, do you want to start?
I haven't seen that figure, and I would question it. Best of my knowledge, they still have tens of billions of dollars in oil reserves. Look, the regime is under pressure, okay? The economic pressure is significant. I don't think it's as significant as a lot of us would like to think it is. The Iranian regime is pretty resilient. They've done this in the past, the so-called resistance economy. They cut back in a whole variety of areas. And when people don't like it, they've got the repressive measures in their hands. Now, yes, 2019, we saw what have been described as the worst demonstrations since the revolution. And I think that the regime may fall anytime 2 seconds or 200 years from now, and we can't speculate any better than that. This is a regime which knows how to handle opposition. It's done it time and again. It may come crashing down at some point, but there's no reason to believe that it's in the foreseeable future.
Dana?
I think Russia and China managed to sell weapons to all sorts of buyers who don't necessarily have hard currency in their reserves, and there's lines of credit and letters of credit and all sorts of ways, if it makes sense for those 2 countries, to buy something based on future payment. And I think the regime, at the end of the day, there's always been a debate in the Iran-watching community as to how revolutionary, ideological versus pragmatic or rational the regime is. The regime will make decisions to ensure its survival. It made the first nuclear agreement, which was a concession to the Great Satan, because it desperately needed sanctions relief. If the sanctions get biting enough that the regime believes they need to make a deal, they certainly believe that they're better negotiators than Donald Trump. And they can string out a negotiation, and to get to a negotiation, there would be some amount of sanctions waivers or a little bit of relief for a little bit of time to help the regime limp along. And on the Green Revolution, Iran is not a democracy despite the fact that they have these elections. They are experts in suppressing protests. They know how to put them down. Their protests are not organized, they're not armed, they're not financed. It'll continue to put some pressure on the regime. I do think the regime has a major credibility problem, especially as this coronavirus situation gets worse and worse. They are already now distrusted by their own population because of the downing of the Ukrainian airliner. The more Iranian officials say nothing to see here, no coronavirus, no problem, and officials of the Iranian regime keep dropping dead, the more and more they have a credibility problem. Whether or not that means that the IRGC loses its expertise in putting people in prison, torturing them and killing them so they don't pose an existential challenge to the regime, I agree with Chuck. The regime is not going to be here forever, but it could be anywhere between next year and 200 years from now.
Let's take the next 2 questions together.
I'm David from Connecticut, and that actually started to answer my question. One of the Ayatollah's closest advisors just died of the coronavirus. Presumably he's going to get it pretty soon. Will Iran go to the way of the people or go to hardline, like Republican Guard type of government after that? And how would the 2 different scenarios impact on our situation.
Okay.
Look, we don't have
Let's just take
good.
let's take two
Oh,
at a time.
sorry.
Yeah, for efficiency, yeah. Please.
My name is Don Dubin from Philadelphia. Is there any case for an effort to destroy the Iranian nuclear capacity? I just want to ask you that question because that is the heart of the problem that they have, a destructive capacity with nuclear weapons, and they're listening to their gods, and we don't know what the gods are saying to them, but we can guess. Thank you.
So the first question is really you somewhat answered about the suppression and repression of the regime, but I guess the question is, what if there actually is something that replaces the current regime? What might it look like? And then I think the questioner was asking whether militarily or otherwise you could destroy what Iran has already. So, Dana, do you want to start with that?
You want to take the first?
I'll take them both. I'm going to address both of them.
I'll respond to the second question. I think if there was an easy, straightforward military solution, it would have been done in the George W. Bush administration, or it would have been done by Israel. It's not that easy, and one of the reasons is because the Iranians know how to make sure that their nuclear weapons program is not vulnerable to being taken out militarily. So it's at different sites all across the country. Some are buried under mountains. Some parts of the system, the nuclear weapon system, are on computers. Some of it is, as we all know, the Obama administration said that the JCPOA eliminated Iran's path to an overt nuclear weapon, but also to covertly breaking out. So a military effort to eliminate Iran's secret nuclear weapons program, I think, is quite difficult. And then even if you could destroy all of the nuclear infrastructure at all of the sites, both hidden and overt, you cannot bomb your way out of the knowledge that exists inside the Iranian regime to develop that nuclear weapons program. They are committed to this. They've been committed to this during the time of the Shah. There's an entire cadre of scientists, nuclear scientists, and all the other weapons experts to both create the nuclear capability and then weaponize it, and you cannot bomb all of that away.
Chuck?
So maybe I'll start from that, because I agree with Dana. I think she's right on there. We may reach the stage where a military option is necessary. And now, speaking from an Israeli perspective, and I'm the guy who's usually advocating moderation and restraint, if and when we reach the point where Iran is about to cross the threshold, I don't think this is something that the state of Israel can allow to happen. Okay, and I'm not one of those who think that Iran is ever going to use a nuclear weapon against Israel if they get it. I don't think they will. My fear is the influence that it will give them in future scenarios, not the actual use. But still, the threat is so great that the state of Israel cannot allow this to happen, even though, again, coming back to what Dana was saying, you can't bomb your way out of this problem at this point because they've got the knowledge. So how much time can we potentially gain? Probably not more than 2 or 3 years. The blowback is going to be really severe. That's why they gave Hezbollah 130,000 rockets, precisely for this scenario. Israel's home front will be hit in a way like we have never experienced before. Never. So there are serious and lots of other consequences. There are big blowback for limited time gain, and I still believe that we have no choice but to do it because we cannot allow Iran to cross the threshold. But we're talking about buying limited time. And if that's the case, if the JCPOA at the time bought us, assuming that Iran adhered to it, if the JCPOA bought us 10 to 15 years, I thought that was a pretty big achievement. And now if we can go back to a new deal, and I said before, and I'm not at all convinced that we can reach that new deal, but I think it's in Israel's fundamental interest to try and reach that deal because it's the only thing that, at a bare minimum, can achieve a long-term postponement and maybe actually prevent this from happening. And here there is a difference between, of course, if there's a Trump administration, a Democratic administration, a Netanyahu government, or a Gantz government. Without saying who the leader is, I think it's in Israel's interest to get back to this deal. to a new deal. It can't be just a JCPOA. That's gone. But a new deal which will, at a bare minimum, extend the sunset for a long time. The first question was about public opinion in Iran, really. It gets back to the regime change thing. We don't know. We don't have good polls of Iranian public opinion. There is still a significant minority, but a minority of people in Iran who strongly believe in the revolution and support the hard line of the regime. There's apparently a majority of people who want some degree of change. Some people just want narrow change. Some people would like to see a real democratization of Iran. And the Iranians, it's not a democracy, but they've got some experience of democracy because they do vote. And Iranians are very worldly. They are wired into the global system. So a lot of people in Iran do want a different reality. But the government controls the means of suppression, and for the foreseeable future, there's no reason to think that they're in trouble.
I'm just going to add one thing to that. So I agree, we don't have good polling on Iran, we don't know, but there's a huge generation in Iran now that was not alive when the Shah came down, so the life they know is under the mullahs, and the agreement with the United States and the rest of the P5+1 offered to them the possibility that diplomacy works,
Right.
and that their government made some concessions and they got some economic relief, and there might have been something better down the road. I know that there was a lot of criticism that that was the whole point from President Obama's point of view, but there were a lot of Iranians believe that too. And now not only do they see that the United States, and they're savvy, they have government controlled access to some sort of internet, but many of them travel. Many of them, I think the greatest number of American PhDs in a foreign country is in Iran. So there are people that understand that there's a different kind of life that is a better, more open life. And now the United States has abandoned that agreement, and we've sent all sorts of other signals to them that they're not welcome here, like the Muslim ban, like limiting access by Iranians that want to travel here, grandparents that can't meet their Iranian American grandchildren here, cutting off. I mean, now there was the announcement of the humanitarian channel to get some goods to Iran last week, 3 years into the Trump administration. So for them, whether it's true or not, they believe that if somebody couldn't get chemotherapy drugs, it's because the United States was blocking them. So there's all these soft power ways in which we could have been reaching out while imposing economic sanctions for the nuclear agreement that didn't happen. So now there's this generation that doesn't believe in diplomacy with the West, and is also understanding that it's not just about your government, we don't want you here either.
Please, next question.
Hi, I'm Lori Balmel from Teaneck, New Jersey. Nice to see you again, Dana. Since we're imagining scenarios here, what if we imagine a scenario that Britain, Boris Johnson, comes along with the United States? The conflict resolution mechanism's been triggered. They can procrastinate and delay that for a very, very long time. But if Britain refers it to the UN Security Council, what happens if the Security Council Resolution 2231, is done away with, and all the previous sanctions come back on Iran before the election, before October, when the arms embargo, is due to come off? Do you see that as a possible scenario? And if those sanctions did come back on Iran in addition to the maximum pressure, do you think that would make any difference? And even if they do get sanction relief eventually, the Financial Action Task Force has now put them back on their blacklist. I don't know why they ever took them off in 2016, but they did for some time, and they did not come through. I'm sure you know the details of that. And so does that affect them as well?
Okay, let's just take the other two questions too, and then we'll let each of them sort of wrap up, give you each like 3 minutes to wrap up. Please.
So you've mentioned this, but while you're speculating, China with Herculean efforts plus the world's most developed countries, the US, Italy, South Korea, pretty much, are not able to contain the coronavirus. And Iran is nowhere near that capability in both of those directions. So I guess while you're speculating, is there a scenario, or how bad would it have to get in Iran in terms of its being cut off from its neighbors, which now it is cut off from many of its Arab neighbors, cut off from the rest of the world in terms of a travel ban that's not a racial travel ban, it's a disease travel ban, before it would actually affect the current government?
Okay, and then the last question, please.
The last question, the Saudis really didn't react when Iran raided their oil fields. I'm wondering if you see the Gulf states acting if the United States and Israel does not, and what role they might play.
All right, so we have like 5 to 6 minutes, so if you could wrap up, at, 3 minutes each, wrap up. You don't have to, each one of you does not have to address every single question. But the first one had to do if the UN triggers snapback and some of the old sanctions are added back on, what might effect that have? The second one had to do with how bad might it get in Iran with the coronavirus before it affects the current government. And then the third question had to do with Saudi Arabia. So it sounds like you guys are dividing it up. And go, Dana, you
Okay, go. Start with the first question last. I see no chance that the Gulf states will take military action without the United States with them. I think they are perfectly happy to let the Israelis pursue their campaign between the wars in Syria. They are exceptionally supportive of the fact that Israel is willing to take the risk and has been very successful in those operations. And I think the Gulf states were both pleased with the Soleimani operation and very nervous about what this meant for the future of U.S. military force against Iran. I was just in Saudi Arabia a week ago, largely across both the government, but then all the Saudis I talked to outside the government, when I asked them about the attack on the Abqaiq, the Saudi Aramco facility, they praised their government for de-escalating. Most Gulf countries are concerned about where the line is, the trigger for the United States to use military force against Iran. They heard Secretary Pompeo and President Trump very clearly about American blood. That line has been made very clear by the 2 actions taken by the Trump administration in early January. But what about Gulf blood being spilled? Has the Trump administration given any commitment to these governments that if their blood is spilled, we're going to take defensive action or even offensive action against them? 1. 2, after the Soleimani operation, what's the next step in that escalation ladder? There's nobody above Soleimani. So is the next step American military action inside Iran, and then we are off to the races? Are they mining the Straits of Hormuz? Are they attacking our bases in Kuwait, UAE, Bahrain, Qatar? And then are we going to take action that implicates all of them? Think about the economy, the commercial interests, the trade interests, civilian aircraft flying, the implications of an escalation of conflict in this part of the world. Everybody loses, and the Gulf countries very well understand that. And in fact, given their concern about where the Trump administration line is in using military force to protect their interests, not just our interests, they're all pursuing their own hedging behavior. So the UAE has sent some very quiet delegations to de-escalate with Iran, and there are rumors aplenty about the Saudis doing the same thing. The Omanis have always kept open channels with Iran, as have the Kuwaitis, and the Qataris have been borrowing Iranian airspace because the rest of the Gulf countries are blocking them off from the Qatar dispute. So I think it's very unclear in the Gulf. They're certainly not unified. They're very concerned about what Washington's next move is going to be, if there's any move, and they are pursuing their own interests, and that is trying to de-escalate with Iran. Corona. There could be a great sorting out. Not only is Iran not prepared, most of these countries are not prepared. Their health systems are not. If our own CDC let people leave hospitals or didn't prepare their workers to how to interact with people coming off of a cruise ship, the countries in this part of the world, I'm not talking about Israel, I'm talking about the Arab governments, are certainly not prepared. There are huge implications economically. We've already seen oil prices drop. The stakes are really high. I can see not just everyone else closing their borders with Iran. I can see all these countries closing their borders to each other. The United States is just instituting a quarantine for people coming from Italy. I mean, so I think we are at the very beginning of the political and foreign policy implications for how these governments respond to coronavirus. It's going to get much uglier.
Chuck, do you want to wrap up and address that question about the snapback of the sanctions?
So first of all, there was something I wanted to say at the beginning of the session, and that's that
Move closer.
There was something that I wanted to say at the beginning of the session, and this is actually my primary recommendation for all of us, whether it's Netanyahu, Gantz, Trump, or the Democrat. The first recommendation is to pray. Okay? I don't know how we go forward here without reaching a crisis point, which could lead to military action. And, well, there's no joy in military action ever, but certainly this is a case where I don't think it resolves anything, and the ramifications are going to be painful for everyone. Look, I think Laurie's question was a great question. I don't think we can allow the weapons sanctions or the missile sanctions to expire at the end of the year. And so that's going to create an earlier crisis, and it's going to feed into Iran's suspicions of what the U.S. wants to do. Oh, if you're actually not allowing that to happen, again, why should we ever trust you for a new deal? But I think that's something that, regardless of who wins in Israel today or in the next round or two, that's something that Israel's going to be pushing for, and I hope that the U.S. will not compromise on that. Look, the Gulf states, if the Saudis ever thought that they had decent military capabilities after spending hundreds of billions, probably even a couple of $1 trillion in recent decades on their military establishment, buying the very latest American weaponry. They've built entire military cities, not just military bases. Well, along comes the Yemen conflict, and I think that showed them exactly what their capabilities are. There is no Gulf Saudi or Gulf military option here. And that's what's driven them in recent years into this growing relationship with Israel. Now, from the open reporting, I don't think we have a good picture of how far it's gone. The very fact that we can talk about this, Saudi Arabia clearly talking to Israel extensively. This is Saudi Arabia, the keeper of the holy places, the seat of all of Islam, Sunni Shia, which spoke about Israel as its arch enemy for decades. And the Crown Prince 2 years ago comes out with a statement recognizing Israel's right to exist as a Jewish state in the Mideast. This was a historic moment in the history of the entire Arab-Israeli conflict. I mean, this was a Sadat-like moment which did not get the credit that it deserves, I don't think. So from the open sources, I would speculate that we can say that there are intelligence exchanges. And there may be even policy coordination in the sense of not joint action, but if you guys do this, we might do this, or if you suggest this to the Americans, we might suggest this to the Americans. This is already phenomenal, and the fact that I think this type of thing we can probably say, and some people have speculated that it may even go beyond that into operational planning. Clearly, if the Saudis don't have the capability, and there's a question whether the U.S. is going to do it, whether Israel may be their last best hope. And Israel's the side which in the end may really, really have no choice but to act here. The big question that I think they've been asking themselves, and I think the answer is beginning to be clear, was the Soleimani killing, this was really a ratcheting up of American action, was this a one-off or not? Now, we've seen Trump conduct hard one-offs in the past, okay? He launched a missile attack against Syria after the use of chemical weapons, said no more chemical weapon attacks. There have been lots of them since then. The American response, zilch. Okay, last spring, the Iranians attack a number of oil attackers. The U.S. does nothing. They down a $130 million American spy drone. The U.S. does nothing. They launched the biggest attack ever, an unimaginable attack on the Saudi oil sector, and the U.S. does nothing. And now we've got, okay, there's the Soleimani thing. It was an important act, but it's beginning to look like a one-off also, and over 100 American troops actually were wounded. It's not true that no one was wounded in the Iranian response, and since then there have been a couple more missile attacks on the American embassy. They're very worried about the American role here. It builds on the abandonment of Mubarak. It builds on a couple of decades already of since the end of the Second Gulf War, growing American disengagement from the region under a number of administrations. So the Gulf states are deeply worried. The good news is that that's producing a closer relationship with Israel.
This has been a fascinating session. I want to thank both Dana and Chuck for their insights. And also for your attention and very good questions. Thanks a lot, everybody.